I'm David Nolan. I'm a former president of the Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings Society that deals with our famous Florida novelist. And today we have with us an old friend of Marjorie's family, and particularly of her second husband, Norton Baskin. He's David Drysdale from the St. Augustine Alligator Farm, where we are today. Well, David, you gave a wonderful talk to the trustees of the Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings Society here back in 2023, and it was so good, and unfortunately we didn't record it at the time. So there's been kind of a groundswell of opinion that we ought to get you down on tape because you really had unique experiences with Norton Baskin, whom you must have known from childhood on.
Well, I did, and I know that the Society's interest is in Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, and I don't remember her. She died when I was 5 years old, but I'm sure I was in her company because my parents were just best friends with Norton, and they socialized together. But I knew him certainly my whole life and kind of idolized him when I was young because he drove white Corvette with red leather interior, and I just thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen.
A famous car that figures in various tales told about Norton that we can get down on this tape.
Sure. Well, and the one I think that you may be referring to was when he was coming back from a party in St. Augustine back when he and Marjorie lived at Crescent Beach. Well, this was after she had passed away, and he'd maybe had one bourbon too many and got behind the mosquito-controlled fogging truck and thought that it was just a little bit of cloud coming through and ran into the back of the mosquito fogging truck, busted up his fiberglass car and had a cut in his chin, and they took his license away from him for several weeks. And then he went to get his license back, went to the patrol office, and the man got in the car and says, "Mr. Baskin, I'm going to tell you what to do." He's got his clipboard, and he came down Cathedral Place, and he says, and came to Cordova, and he says, "Come up to this stop sign, stop, and take a left." And Norton says, I came up to the stop sign, and I slowed down really, really slowly, but I guess I didn't quite totally stop. So I got back, and the guy says, "I'm sorry, Mr. Baskin, I have to fail you on this because the sign said stop, and you slowed down and you were safe, but you didn't stop. And the sign didn't say slow down a lot. It said stop. So you're going to have to come back in 2 weeks." He goes, "God, So in 2 weeks, he comes back to take the test again, and he, by chance, gets the same evaluator and goes through the same routine, and he comes up to us and he says, "Come up to this stop sign, stop and take a right." And Norton pulls up to the stop sign, stops the Corvette, turns it off, and looks at the guy and says, "If you have any errands to run around town, please go ahead and do it because I'm going to be here for a while." So he just was clever in every way.
And he was a great storyteller. He didn't write, but what a storyteller.
Well, he did write a little, and that's another interesting story about him. And what he and Marjorie had to share together was literature. I mean, he read a lot. And when he was in India during World War II, he would write her letters. And you've seen the many, many letters that she wrote him in the collection of the letters that the University of Florida published. And so he was writing back to her, and she took the liberty of showing some of his letters to Maxwell Perkins. And Maxwell told Marjorie, says, "Norton really has a talent, and you should encourage him to write more." So she told him that, and he told me, he says, "And my God, when I heard that, I'm just writing everything about my childhood in Alabama and my impressions of everything in the world." And I sent it to Marjorie, and he said, "I got a short letter back that said, on second thought, one author in the family is enough. If you get off the boat with a manuscript under your arm, I'll shoot you like a rat with the plague." He says, that was the end of my literary career.
Now, did your parents ever talk about how they first crossed paths with Norton and Marjorie? St. Augustine was a smaller place back then.
Well, it was, and they, they had the place in Cross Creek, and the home that they bought in Crescent Beach, they actually bought from Ralph Poole, who was one of the original founders of Marineland. And I don't know whether Terry met Ralph Poole years ago on a sailboat race in Key West. He lived down there, but so. I don't know whether it had something to do with Marineland, because, as you know, Norton managed the Dolphin restaurant at Marineland, and it was I'm sure they had mutual friends. But I can't tell you exactly when they met.
And when you think of Norton, do you think of places? Do you think of Marineland or the Dolphin or Cross Creek or here in town?
Well, he lived on Dolphin Drive, and so we lived back then on the bayfront in the restaurant now. It's Harry's, is where I grew up, and so every Christmas party, we were back and forth at one event or the other. So I guess I spent a lot more time with him after I got out of school. I went away to prep school and then went away to college. But after I graduated from college and came back, he and my parents would come over to my house like every Tuesday. And it was just a regular thing. And of course, especially after we went to the premiere of Cross Creek and at the Cannes Film Festival. And, my parents and Norton and I went, and then we made a big trip of it around France and back to London. And I remember him saying, he says, in this house, boy, you need to build some more bookshelves because I'm going to fill them up. And he would, and every Tuesday he'd come with some books to give me. And there were, lots of them. I've got a couple of them here that I think I've talked to you about before. And if you wanted to go through these now, that's fine with me.
Yeah, let's tell the story that goes with them.
Well, the story of this first one is the complete poems of Robert Frost, 1949, and of course they had many famous people that visited them, and Robert Frost was one of them. And when he was there staying with Marjorie and Norton, he gave them one of these books, and it was a limited edition author's copy signed by the author and all that. And so when he's making the presentation, he opens it up and starts writing in the book. And Norton and Marjorie are standing there watching him. He keeps writing on and on. And Norton looks at her and says, do you think he's composing poetry as we're watching him? And she says, I have no idea what he's doing. But at any rate, so he filled up, as you can see, the whole, the front pages are all his handwriting. And after each poem, he's got a little R. And then he's got signed it and the number. It says with some special extras for Marjorie. But what these are poems that are in the book that he wrote from memory.
Wow.
So anyway, he gave me that one, and I don't know if you want to get a
Can we get a close up of the thing here? What's the best way?
Yeah. That's the first one. Is the only one that's a title, and it says it's departmental, and it's one of the poems that's in the book. And then these are the others, and then his special note to her is there. So the other one is Finnegan's Wake, and you probably have read Finnegan's Wake. I read the first sentence and gave up. But Thornton Wilder was visiting them, and they were talking, of course, about literature, and he says, have you read Finnegan's Wake? And Norton says, well, I've read it, but I didn't understand any of it. And Thornton Wilder says, well, there are probably only 5 or 6 people in the world that understand that book. I happen to be one of them because it's got puns in 7 different languages and it's complicated. He says, do you have a copy of it? And Norton says, I do. He says, well, let me see it. So he took the book and just opened it at random and took out a pen and just started making marginal notes as to what it meant. And of course, Norton says, I didn't understand the notes, but it's pretty remarkable. There's if I can find it in here. You think I'd have enough sense to put a bookmarker? I know what they are. I think it's closer to the back. Yeah, here we go. So then maybe you can understand what the notes mean.
Not without my glasses. Let's see. Wow, I can barely decipher the handwriting.
Well, there's that too.
Incredible. Wow. You want to get a shot of this? Yeah. And now you talked about going to the Cannes Film Festival, which must have been quite a thing. I remember Norton talking about various press conferences and everything there. Did you sit in on them?
We did, but I've always found that going from west to east is much more difficult than coming the other way. And we flew together to Nice, and since there were 5 of us traveling, I wanted to try to get a car that was a little bit bigger. I couldn't just take a regular rental car because we always wanted to go in one. So I says, is there some kind of van? Well, called Budget, because they rent vans. And I said, that'll be perfect. We have plenty of room for the luggage because we're going to go after the film festival, we're going up to Lyon, then to Paris, then to the Normandy, and then we're going on to London. And so I've got it all taken care of. I've got the van rented, and we're going to the big deal at Cannes. And so we get to the airport, get all the luggage checked. I go to the budget counter, got all those things taken care of, paid for, and go out and says, I'll go get the van and I'll bring it up here and we'll pick up all the luggage. I go out there and the van is a nice van, but on both sides, the front and the back, it says Budget in letters this high in black. I thought, my God, everybody's pulling up in limos and we're pulling up in Budget, But we had no choice. So anyway, we went, and it was first afternoon that we got there was the festival. And so we went to the theater. And had seats there. We were right behind Norton, and it was packed. And I think Mary Steenburgen was there. Rip Torn was not, and I can't remember whether Peter Coyote was there or not. But at any rate, so we watched the whole film, and when it was over, everybody's applauding, and it was very, very well received. And then the announcer came over and says, we have some special guest here. And he introduced an actor and Mary Steenburgen, and they all applauded. And it says, we have a special guest here. The real Norton Baskin is here with us. And he stood up, and that place exploded. It was terrific. It really was fun. We had a great trip after that. Went to went over to Avignon, then up to Lyon, and then through the Loire Valley, and went to Paris, and then down to the Invasion beaches. And when we were in London, we stayed at the Savoy, which Norton insisted we stay at the Savoy. And they've got a little bar there called the American Bar, and we'd go there every afternoon and have drinks, and they had these little dishes that were divided in 3, and they had cashews and olives and little homemade potato chips, and it was the same thing every night, but it was our little tradition while we were there. So that got to be the slogan. I'd say, Norton, we're going to, open up the American Bar on Tuesday night. You and Evie and Driz come by. So, we had great, fond memories of that trip. And, he's just such a delightful companion to do something like that with. It was great fun.
And do you have memories of the first time you saw the Yearling movie? Do you have... You must have been mighty young, but...
Well, that was filmed in 49. I would have been 45. Well, then I wouldn't have been born. Yeah, but so no, I don't, and I'm sure I did see that, but I don't have a recollection of it. I'll have to find it on Netflix so I can be up to date.
And do you have any memories of eating? I mean, I've heard people talk about Norton's restaurant down at Marineland, and does that ring bells with you?
Well, I've been there so many times, and then I was involved with Marineland, after he had left. But he, he had a number of well-known friends that we talked about that had visited. And on one occasion, Norton and Marjorie were having dinner in the Dolphin restaurant, and she called their favorite waiter over, whose name was Billy, and said, "Billy, I want you to hand this note to the gentleman that's at the table over there in the corner." And the note said, "If you're really Ernest Hemingway, I'd like to buy you a drink." And he says, "Okay." And he takes the note and goes over, hands it to this guy. And the guy opens up the note and looks over at who sent it. And he writes down, "If you're not Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, I'm not Ernest Hemingway." And it was Hemingway, and they got to be friends. And he made it, I don't know how many times he stopped, but numerous times on it, going from Ketchum, Idaho down to Key West. He'd make a stop there to visit with them. And on one of these occasions, Bill Rolliston was the general manager, and he knew that Hemingway was there. And he said, when he comes in, how about seeing if we can get a newspaper article about it? Norton says, "I don't want to bother him about that. He's trying to get away from all that." And he said, "Well, you can just ask him. If he says no, that's all right." So Norton says, "Okay." So he asked him, he says, "I'd be glad to do that, whenever." He says, "Well, how about tomorrow at 10 o'clock. I said, "That's perfect. We'll meet in the Moby Dick Lounge." And so the St. Augustine Record sends some young green reporter down there, and she has her little steno pad and walks in, and Norton picks her out, calls her over, introduces her to Ernest Hemingway, and they sit down, and she freezes and can't come up with anything. And at that point, Norton said, Hemingway looked at me and he says, "This is your interview, and it's however you want to do it is fine with me. I'll do anything you want. But why don't you think of something different? What would you think if maybe I asked myself some questions and then kind of answered them, and it'd be different?" But and she said, "Oh yeah, that'd be fine." And he conducted the whole interview, and asking himself questions, and she's just scribbling it all down. But they had, I think that time in their lives at Marineland and the Dolphin restaurant was very rewarding to them, and they had a rich life wherever they went.
Wasn't there something special about the Moby Dick Lounge? It wasn't just your ordinary go in and sit at the bar place.
Well, it was an ordinary go in and sit at the bar place, but the bartender could turn a switch and the bow of the boat would rise and fall, and that made it interesting. But the short story I was going to tell you about one of the dinner parties that Norton and Marjorie had planned there was a small group, and Norton sent an invitation to his friend Owen D. Young that lived just south of Marineland, who was a former chairman of General Electric and a very, very prominent figure in American history. And he owned the property that's now Washington Oaks State Park, and he had a little orange grove there, and he would sit out on A1A with a card table and a straw hat and sell oranges to some of the tourists coming by. They had no idea who they were dealing with, but they invited Owen D. Young and his wife to come to this dinner party, and he said he called and regretted and said, I just can't make it. We've got a house guest, and I couldn't. Norton says, well, that's fine. Please bring your house guest. And he says, I couldn't do that. It would be just inappropriate. He says, please, Marjorie would be so upset. Please come. And he says, if you're sure it's all right, yeah, it's fine. Well, he shows up, and his house guest was Charles Evans Hughes, who's the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court at the time. So, yeah, I think they had a lot of interesting times there.
And now Marjorie passed away in the old Flagler Hospital here in St. Augustine, and your mother was there with Norton. Is that true?
She was there with Norton when she had a cerebral hemorrhage, and yeah, she was there. She was there with him, and I think I've told you this before, but when they came out and told that she had passed away, Norton said, "Oh, she was so damn mean, and I loved her so much."
Oh.
But they were, they must have had a wonderful. Well, you can tell by reading her letters what a wonderful time they had together.
And then Norton had a long widowerhood. 40-some years.
Oh yeah.
And I think that he probably depended on your parents even more in those years.
Well, I don't know that they depended on them, but they just enjoyed each other's company, and they traveled together. And, going back to when I was in camp, they took when my brother was, I guess we were 9 and 10, they took us up to camp in Massachusetts and dropped us off for 2 months while they took off for Europe, and but they had a great time. I mean, there are stories there. They were visiting that castle in Segovia, and there's a walkway that goes up to the castle, and it's the castle's like the Cinderella's castle looking thing with a sheer drop on either side, and they got up to the big entrance, and Norton wasn't there. And Abby looked around, and he wasn't back towards where they had parked. And there was a little walkway that went around this turret, but he couldn't have done that. And she's just starting to panic, and she looks over the edge and looks down and says, "My God, Driz." And as she's looking down, he runs over and looks over the edge and says, "Damn it, he's got my camera." But he had, for some reason, decided he wanted to see what was on the other side of that turret, and had kind of inched his way on that ledge around there, and then came back, and all was okay. But they'd go to these cathedrals, and of course, my father was a Catholic, not the best Catholic in town by a long shot, and Norton was not. And every cathedral they'd go in, Driz would find the little confession that says, "Come here, Norton, you ready to give your first confession? I'll take care of it for you." And he had done that numerous times until one time he says, "Are you ready to make your first confession?" And Norton says, "No, I am not. But when I am, the first confession I'm going to make is that I've been traveling around Europe with a heathen for 2 months." But they had a great friendship. Really did.
And they were both big football fans, UF, weren't they?
Yeah, they would ride that bus. There was a group of guys from St. Augustine. Every time the Gators played in Gainesville, they'd ride the bus over there. They had a lot of fun doing that too.
Gosh. And they both wound up at Vickers Landing for a time.
They did. And Norton, my father, was suffering a lot more from dementia in his older years, and Norton had moved up there before he did. And so when my father moved up there, Norton just took him under his wing and had dinner with him every night, and then my father came back to St. Augustine before he passed away, and Norton, stayed up there till the end.
And now they shared an interest in history too. I think they were both directors of the St. Augustine Historical Society over the years.
I think they were, and of course, my father was, interested in St. Augustine's history, and was God, so long ago. He was chairman of the 400th anniversary, which was in 1965. And actually, the amphitheater was his idea. And he had seen when we were traveling, he'd taken us to a number of these symphonic dramas, Unto These Hills and The Lost Colony, and a number of them. And he wanted something like that for St. Augustine. And he, in his research, figured that Paul Green was the best symphonic outdoor drama playwright. And it won a Pulitzer Prize. And so they were driving my brother and me up to prep school in Virginia, and we went by Chapel Hill and called on Paul Green, and that's where my father talked him into writing Cross and Sword. And I've got a copy of the script, and the published script, and it says to Driz and Evie in the front of it. But yeah, and Norton was, of course, he read everything. He just was, big library of books that he had read them all.
Now, I remember Norton also talking about Gene Johnson, who was quite a character here. Do you have recollections on Norton? Said some Midwest reporter came down to write a story about the Dolphin Restaurant and heard about Gene Johnson and wrote about Gene Johnson instead.
Well, and we had, when I was younger, we had a home at Summer Haven on the it's now Gene Johnson Road. It's a little dirt road. And there, Bert Hernandez lived down there, Harry Brandman, us, and Gene Johnson. There were like 4 houses on that little road. And Gene and his wife, Maddie, and his daughter, Persephone, lived in what was a shack at the north end of that little road. And he'd collect oysters and baskets. And then on the other side of the little dirt road, he had like a tin shed out there with wooden picnic tables, and he'd build a big bonfire under this large steel sheet that was up on concrete blocks, and he'd dump the oysters on that and then have croaker sacks soaked in the river water that he'd lay over those. And Maddie would make clam chowder and sauces and stuff, and they would have, serve these oysters and on all these picnic tables. And frequently they would have gospel music singers down there. And the group that I remember hearing about, and actually one of the members of the group helped take care of my father in the nursing home, and they called their group the Ancient City 4, 5, or 6, because he didn't know how many of them were going to show up. So, but they were just terrific. And so, there'd be a little bit of bourbon down there for those events. And yeah, it was a tradition. I think that health department finally shut him down because he didn't have enough fire extinguishers and everything else.
Oh, gosh. And now another person that you all knew in common was Ross Allen.
Sure.
Who Marjorie wrote about and who later in his career was here at the Alligator Farm. Tell us about him.
Well, he was really something else too. And he's one of his stories was that he had, of course, the Ross Allen Reptile Institute at Silver Springs for years, and was a really terrific naturalist and probably knew more about Florida wildlife than anybody, but made a number of expeditions to South America collecting animals. And I think it was a raccoon that Marjorie and Norton had that they'd kind of wanted to make a pet out of, but as many wild animals don't make as good a pets as you might think they do. Norton says, I've got to take this thing to Ross. So he took it to the Reptile Institute. And several days later, Ross called him and says, Norton, don't do me any more favors. He says, what do you mean? He says, not only did that raccoon escape, he led a jailbreak. He got out of his cage and went down the road, letting everybody else loose. But yeah, Ross was amazing guy.
And are there particular times you think about Norton? Now, I know on the way over here from downtown, I drove by 77 Dolphin Drive, which is up for sale now.
Well, I saw that.
And unfortunately, the sign says 152 feet of waterfront. It doesn't say this historic house.
Well, that's right. Well, it was, and he built that. He built that big addition to it for his sister to move down as they were getting older, and they were quite old when he did it. But he just wanted them to, have a place close to him, so he built that big addition. And then his was it Janice? What were their names?
Janice and Sarah.
Sarah and Janice. And I don't know if it was Sarah or Janice, but he said she was beginning to fall to the dark cave of dementia, and he would go in to see her every day, and he'd have a little sign that says, "Your name is Sarah Baskin, and I'm your brother Norton." And he'd hold that up to kind of orient her. And he was talking to her on one of these occasions, and he said that she says, "Norton, sometimes I just want to just stop breathing till it all goes away." And he said, "Sarah, don't go reaching for my nose." But that was, we spent a lot of time there. And that's the first place I ever had ratatouille, because he had a recipe, and I didn't know what in the world he was going to serve to eat, but he liked to cook a little bit and watch football games over there. Had a lot of fun in that house.
And now, I always thought it was really ironic that he was such a great storyteller, but he had stage fright. In a small room, he would charm the socks off anybody, but every time you tried to invite him to speak somewhere.
No, that's true. He was just like that. And I remember one time he was telling me, and I don't know what this really meant, but he says, "You've got the same problem that I've got. You want everybody to be your friend." And he said that sometimes that doesn't work. But he was everybody's friend. He was just one of the greatest guys I've ever known.
And now we had talked earlier, but I think before the camera was on, so let's do this again, about filming the movie Cross Creek, where he made his Hollywood appearance.
Yeah, they had tried to talk him into having a little bit part in the movie Cross Creek, which he just refused for the same reasons that you'd mentioned earlier. And he was, in fact, I remember he told me he was talking to Sarah about that, and he said, "They want me to be in this movie, but I can't do that because I can't take credit for that. She wrote the thing, not me." And Sarah looked at him and says, "Well, you take the money. Why don't you take some of the credit?" And he said, "It just cut me hard." But at any rate, they talked him into taking this little bit part, and you remember it's when Mary Steenburgen drives into the little town. She goes up to the country store and says she's looking for this property that she'd purchased down there, and this little guy says, "Well, you need to go to the hotel and ask for Norton Baskin." And that was Norton, of course. But he told me that when he went down there to do the filming, that he was there early in the morning, and he went into the little room where they put everybody together, and they put the blue jean overalls on him and his plaid shirt and brogans and his
typical way Norton dressed.
It's not the way he dressed, but it's the way his character would have dressed. And when she finishes, now, Mr. Baskin, you go right out that door and you'll be on the set, and they'll show you right where to go. And he says, "Well, this is a Hollywood movie. I mean, what about the makeup? Don't you need to put the makeup on me and all that?" And he said, this gal looked at her clipboard and said, "Mr. Baskin, it says here you're supposed to be a little old man. You are a little old man." He I guess he had to join the Screen Actors Guild to get in there. But yeah, he was in the show.
And was he given to reminiscing about his experiences in World War II?
I heard a little bit about that. He had he told us, he was an ambulance driver. He said he would volunteer, but that he wouldn't carry a gun. He said, "I'll do anything you want me to do, but I just can't shoot anybody." And of course, everybody back then was wanting to volunteer. My wife's grandfather, Carl Harris, went down to the Navy recruiter to sign up, and they said, "Well, Mr. Harris, what do you feel you'll be most qualified as?" And he says, "Civilian. I've had 32 years experience." But he ended up being, a flight instructor, and he had flown nothing but a little Piper Cub, and they put him in a big rotary engine trainer, gave him an hour in that, made him an instructor. Of course, you were doing whatever you could back then. But Norton ended up with the Canadian or the Brit. He was a British ambulance driver in India, and he got malaria. He got very, very ill. I don't know how long he was there, but it was quite a while. But he told us of one occasion when he's driving an ambulance somewhere through the mountains, and he hears this terrible noise and trees crashing down. He stops the ambulance, and he said it was an elephant that was sliding on his rear end coming down the mountain and banged into the road in front of him, bounced, and then continued down the other side. If it would have landed on the ambulance, it wouldn't have been good.
When Norton and Marjorie came here, he opened kind of our first boutique hotel, the Castle Warden.
Right.
Now, that would have been before your time, but did he ever have tales about that?
Well, there's some tales about that in Marjorie's letters, but I was never there when it was Ripley's Believe It or Not museum is all I remember.
Far back as you can remember.
Yeah, my earliest recollection was him at the Dolphin Restaurant.
Okay. Now, how about Union Springs, Alabama?
Okay.
Have you ever been to Union Springs, Alabama?
No, I haven't. But I do remember that Norton and Marjorie, or Norton telling me if they're attending some fancy cocktail party in New York City, perhaps given by Harcourt Brace Jovanovich or one of these big publishers, and there are all these important New Yorkers there. And so one of these New York socialites is talking to Norton, and she says, "And Mr. Baskin, where are you from?" And he says, "Well, I'm from Union Springs, Alabama." And she says, "Oh, how divine. Mother and I have often talked of spending the season there." To which Norton replied, "Which season would that be, picking or planting?"
Did you ever stay at the house in Cross Creek? Or?
No, I mean, I've been there, but not when they had it. But I do recall Norton telling me one story. He was, and I've forgotten the names of all the characters. Was it Will?
Will Mickens, Will and Martha Mickens.
Right. Will was out there one day, and Norton had gone into the little chicken and duck coop to feed the chickens or something, and when the door slammed behind him, the latch had clicked. And so he went to walk out and tried to open the door, and the latch was locked. And Will was out there, and he calls her. He says, "Will, come here. Unlock this. Let me unlock this thing." And Will walked over and looked at him and says, "Miss Marjorie put you in there?" Because if she did, I'm not letting you. He had some stories to tell.
Do you know if did he like Cross Creek? I mean, Charles didn't like it apparently, but did Norton like Cross Creek?
Well, I think he did. I mean, when they started out, he was still in Ocala managing the hotel in Ocala when they met, and then he started spending time over there, and then spent a little bit more. But I think he did, and they certainly loved the place at Crescent Beach, and the Castle Warden. You need to interview him.
And the Savoy Hotel.
And the Savoy Hotel, yeah, that was fun.
And I don't remember the Corvette, but I remember the Cadillac. So,
And I'll tell you another one was that you remember the Mercedes he had?
no.
And I can't remember. There was like a 280 SE or something, but it was a bronze Mercedes with a dark brown convertible top. It was a two-door, and he picked it up on one of the trips with my parents to Europe and bought the car and then brought it back, and we should have never let that get away because that car today would be worth a fortune. I mean, they're collectible. But, back then, like a lot of things, it was just a very, very nice car.
Wow.
Yeah. Norton and my father also joined the Seminole Club in Jacksonville years ago, and they would drive up, I think, every Wednesday, go up there and get a massage and have a couple of martinis and have lunch and then drive back.
Wow.
So that's about all I can think of.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Sure.
You'll be glad to know that Norton's niece, Sally Hooker, and grandniece, Ginger Maurer, are trustees of the Rawlings Society now. So I think he's smiling down on them.
Well, that's good.
Well, I think that you have done a good deed for history there.
Well, I don't know. I think I've always thought that, when they start asking you to record something, it's not a good sign.
It means you're still compass mentis
Get this on
enough.
tape before it's over.
Oh.